Because Ukraine is gone. It's not Ukraine anymore. And it's our fault because it's a war that should have never been allowed to happen, and we had the power that it would never have happened.
If we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent? He said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay. You got to pay your bill.
My guest today is Tim Snyder, a professor of history at Yale and an author of multiple best-selling books, including On Tyranny, a #1 New York Times bestseller, and its follow-up On Freedom. Tim, I hope you sell 1 million copies of this book, because it affected me in ways that few books have. And I got a shelf full of them, of people I've interviewed. But from the very opening scene, your interview with Maria in Posad-Pokrovsk, a small town that I was in 2 weeks ago, completely devastated. Here's some footage of that town as it stands today.
We just drove through and nothing was left standing by the Russians. Even the smallest little farm shack was blown apart. Pockmarks in the walls, if the walls were even standing. We're at this gas station, which I guess arguably could be considered a target, but everything around has been leveled by the Russians, and the Ukrainians, in spite of it, are building back.
The Russians leave nothing behind when they come through a village like this. Here's a parking lot full of spent artillery shells, but this is evidence of the cleanup.
Drove through, and the cleanup effort after the Russian occupation has begun. In ways, it reminds you of a cleanup effort in an American town after, say, a tornado comes through and devastates the community. The difference here is that the cleanup includes unexploded ordnance, charges for artillery shells, and it's just devastating to remind yourself that every single one of these represents a shell. In some cases, there are shells here. These are rockets. These represent ordnance that landed on this community, and it's not a big community. In that village just across the street, there wasn't a single structure left unscathed. Most of them were completely demolished. All of them had shrapnel scars or actual bullet scars in the facades. And I just want to give a sense of what these things do. I mean, obviously, these rockets, when they hit, they fragment, they send pieces everywhere. This is an actual shell, part of a Russian shell, and I'm not going to get too near it, but I want to give you a sense of what they do. When they break apart, these heavy bits of iron fly through the air faster than the speed of sound and tear through anything they encounter. Buildings, bodies. The Russians shot pets as they passed through this town. It was the kind of bloodlust you think about from medieval times. I can't begin to describe it. This pile of shells only scratches at the surface of the horror these people endured.
Ukraine is building back, and it is inspiring to behold, even in a scene of utter devastation like this. Tim, is Ukraine gone?
Of course, Ukraine's not gone. Ukraine's one of the liveliest places in the world. I mean, insofar as you can define, life or death in terms of people's determination, not only to live, but to show what life is all about. Ukraine is an amazing place. The idea that it's gone, I mean, that's Trump says things like that because he's trying to prepare people's minds for a world in which he gives up on Ukraine and the Russians win the war and horrible things happen. So if he tells us now that it's gone, then after he allows Putin to destroy it, he can say, well, it was already gone. That's the only meaning to that expression of his. It's a terrible, terrible thing to say for another reason, though, which is that the Ukrainians are struggling so that we won't be gone. Like we think of them as a problem. They're the solution. They're holding back the Russians. They're keeping Europe going. They're keeping the international order going. They're deterring the Chinese. They're doing all these things which mean that we're not gone. So it's it pains me that people could make a mistake on that scale. It's not, it's a wrong in every sense. It's factually wrong. And also it's an injustice to people who are working very hard and taking great risks.
You were the first person who got me thinking about Ukraine in historic terms, in terms of 1938. And I've been using that framing ever since. Can you explain not just 1938, but more importantly, 1939, and why it's so important that Ukraine holds the line in a way the international community, and not to put too much blame on Czechoslovakia, but in a way that Czechoslovakia did not in 1938?
Yeah, I'm glad to do that. So we hover around comparisons to the Second World War here, and for good reason. The Second World War was largely about Ukraine, at least in Europe. And the Second World War is our model of how bad things can be, and that's perfectly reasonable. The point that I've been trying to make is that, helpful as those analogies can be, a better way to think about this is that Ukraine is keeping us out of that situation. Ukraine is bearing the brunt itself. And the way to see that point is to consider, as you've already suggested, Czechoslovakia in 1938. So Czechoslovakia in 1938, the year before the Second World War begins, is given up by its allies. Like Ukraine, it's a complicated but nevertheless democratic state, most important democracy in Eastern Europe at the time, the last one, in fact, in 1938. And what happens is that Hitler makes threats. And he makes threats very much like Putin's threats. He says, those people are my people. He says that state is not legitimate. He calls a democratic regime names, even though he's the dictator. And in 1938, the international community, the Americans, the British, the French, cave. And as a result of that, Germany becomes much stronger. The Czechoslovaks choose not to fight. The Germans absorb Czechoslovak territory. They take Czechoslovak wealth. They take the Czechoslovak arms industry, which, like the Ukrainian one, was incredibly strong and interesting. And with the help of that territory, that wealth, those resources, Germany then begins the Second World War in 1939. So the Ukrainians, unlike the Czechoslovaks, chose to resist and chose to fight. And then because they chose to fight, they've had some help. And because they're fighting and have some help, they're holding back things which are much, much worse. And that's the credit they should get. The credit they should get is for holding back a conflict which could be much bigger and which could draw the rest of us in.
You have said this won't end, though, with that kind of stalemate. Russia has to be defeated, and it has to know it's been beaten. What does that look like, and how does that happen?
Well, it has to do with politics. War is ultimately about politics. War is a way of putting pressure on the other side's political system. And the Russians began this war with the idea that a few days of pressure on Kyiv would be enough, because they underestimated and fundamentally misunderstood what Ukrainian society was. We, to a large extent, and I think to our shame, and also it also creates a lasting problem for our calculations. We shared some of that misunderstanding of Ukraine. We thought the Ukrainian system was weaker than it was. And now that we understand that it's stronger, and now that we see how it resists, it's our job to get them over the top. Because in a war like this, one side or the other is eventually going to crack. And so you have to pick a side. You can't just say, like, we prefer negotiations or we prefer there not to be a war. I mean, who wouldn't prefer for there not to be a war? But there is one. And the Russians have made it very clear that they intend to crush the Ukrainian political system. And so Ukraine has to resist until that aspiration becomes untenable on the Russian side. That can mean Putin leaves power. That can mean somebody overthrows Putin. That can mean Putin changes the story. That can mean they have to resist until Putin dies. That can mean they have to resist until something else happens in Russia. But it means they have to resist until that aspiration to destroy them becomes untenable and the Russian system is forced to change. There really isn't an alternative here. And I mean, the mistake of the Biden administration has been to draw out this story longer than it needed to be drawn out. The mistake of the Trump administration, of course, would be much more fundamental, which is to hand the victory over to the Russians.
Right. One of the most striking things about the Ukrainian people, and I don't think it's something one can appreciate unless you're there, unless you're talking to them, is the value they place on life. And I think that might be easy to take for granted until you're talking to a Ukrainian widow or a Ukrainian son. I met this soldier at the flag memorial in Maidan Square who was straightening a flag planted in honor of his father, who's still missing from the first days of the war, likely still on a battlefield in the occupied territory. Can you help us contrast that with the Russian way of war, which is totally dismissive of the value of life? It uses its troops like cannon fodder. I want to roll this clip first of the yard in front of the cultural center in Posad, Pokrovsk. The only thing I've seen like it in person is the area around the presidential palace in Kabul. The density of fire is just almost impossible to understand. Every cubic meter of air had shrapnel flying through it at one point. Take a look.
This is a cultural center dating back to Soviet times, but that certainly didn't spare it from the Russian assault. The thing I want to point out is just the unbelievable density of fire, of shrapnel. The only other place I've seen anything like this is Kabul, Afghanistan. If you look at the lampposts, every single one, this one behind me to my right, the one behind me to my left, they're all pockmarked with bullet holes or shrapnel scars, and it just gives you a sense of the density of fire that even a single solitary lamppost, and every single one of them was in the way of shrapnel flying through the air. The courtyard itself has 3 shell holes in the paving stones from artillery rounds that dropped in this area. The devastation's just extraordinary. But the Ukrainians who lived here haven't given up. There is a field of cows right in front of me. They're carrying on.
Let's be honest, the aging process is not our friend when it comes to energy and productivity. That's where Qualia Senolytic comes in. Senolytics are a class of ingredients discovered less than 10 years ago, and they have enormous potential for promoting healthy aging. As we age, everyone accumulates senescent cells in their body. These cells cause symptoms of aging like aches and discomfort, slow workout recoveries, sluggish mental and physical energy associated with that middle-aged feeling. Also known as zombie cells, these cells are old and worn out and not serving a useful function for our health anymore, but they are taking up space and nutrients from our healthy cells. Take Qualia Senolytic just 2 days a month. The formula is non-GMO, vegan, gluten-free, and the ingredients are meant to complement one another, factoring in the combined effect of all ingredients together. It has a 100-day money-back guarantee. New research on aging and longevity, including a clinical study on Qualia Senolytic, shows that senolytic supplementation can play a huge role in enhancing how we age. So give Qualia Senolytic a try. Go to qualialife.com/boats for up to 50% off and use code BOATS at checkout for an additional 15% off. For your convenience, Qualia Senolytic is also available at select GNC locations near you. That's QUALIA life.com/boats for an extra 15% off your purchase. Thanks to Qualia for sponsoring today's episode. Tim, can you share with us how the Russians wage war and just how utterly brutal it is?
I mean, we're talking about Russia and Ukraine, but I think what underlies the difference is something which goes beyond the nationalities. Like these aren't just colors on a map. They're not just names. It's 2 different ways of organizing society based on 2 very different views of life, really, as you say. Russia is fighting this war on the basis of one man's fantasy. It's fighting this war on the basis of one man's fantasy that Ukraine isn't real. And therefore, Ukraine's not real. Nothing that you're doing on that side of the border really counts. From the Russian point of view, those are all it's a fraud. It doesn't exist. There aren't Ukrainian soldiers even. They're all Poles. They continue to think. So we're not doing anything wrong. And the Russian system is organized entirely vertically, where all that matters is in the end of the day, the fantasy of one person. And so it doesn't mean anything for that system for someone to go and die. There's no meaning whatsoever attached to that, except a kind of base political fear, which is that too many of the wrong kind of people dying would be bad. So the Russians first send off the men under occupation to die. Then they send off the national minorities to die. Then they send off the poor people to die. So there is a kind of politics of it, but that's it. There's zero intrinsic concern. And on the Ukrainian side, it's less than zero. Those people should die because they don't deserve to exist. Whereas on the Ukrainian side, I mean, of course, it's a complicated society and people are different, and I'm not trying to say that everybody's exactly the same, but on the Ukrainian side, the basic understanding is something like everybody has a right to life. The future is going to be better than the present. Our politics have been set up so that each generation is actually doing better than the generation before. We have hopes, and those hopes are individual. We don't believe that there's a big leader up there who can tell us what to do. We're not all going to fall prey to an illusion, even because we believe in it or because someone's going to send us off to die for it. And so the meaning of death on the two sides, as you say, is just so drastically different. I mean, on the Russian side, it means that the state sends some money to a widow and takes her picture, basically. On the Ukrainian side, you have these touching and complicated and regionally different rituals of mourning. You have all of these different attempts to remember people on an individual basis. And you have a government which needs to win the war, but also doesn't want its people to die. And not just as a political calculation, but like as a human commitment, which is visible on the faces and in the behavior of the people who have to fight this war, which of course is one more cost on the Ukrainian side. Like these are human beings making difficult choices. Whereas on the Russian side, Putin wants to die in bed and be remembered as someone who won some territory. That's it. Whereas on the Ukrainian side, you have clever, intelligent people fighting a war very well, but who are bearing human costs the entire time. That's a difference which one does sense.
I have hesitated to share this clip because done the wrong way, it feeds this narrative that the costs of this war are too high to bear. But I'm going to contextualize it. This is a cemetery in Lviv, which a year ago didn't exist. They've taken over a park. I was driving past with my interpreter, and she saw it and started crying because half of this park is now filled with Ukrainian flags. Here's the clip.
We're on the outskirts of Lviv, and we pulled over because our interpreter saw this cemetery and said it wasn't here the last time. The flags, the graves go all the way seemingly to the horizon. You can't see the end of them. They just had a ceremony. I saw the honor guard. We're not going to show it, but the honor guard just marched by. And the thing that I guess is most striking to me is how much they still have to fill. They set aside this entire park for the bodies of the fallen in this war, and half of it is yet to be claimed.
Tim, the important thing to remind people of here is that this is a cost the Ukrainians have asked to bear for the rest of the world. They're not asking for American boots on the ground. They just want American weapons. And I find it so incredibly frustrating for us to make the moral calculation for them that this isn't a war worth fighting, especially when you see the cost they're bearing in a Spartan-like way. They are modern-day Spartans, and they know they are doing it for the rest of the free world.
Yeah, they know they're doing it for us, but they almost never talk about that, like it's part of their humility, and they don't expect that much of us. Like they don't expect us to understand what this kind of war is like, let alone fight in it, as you say. And I mean, to say the kind of thing that Americans don't really like to say or hear, we haven't been in a war like this. We will never be in a war like this. The kind of density of fire that you describe in Posad Pokrovsk, as you know very well, that could be multiplied 1,000 times over. The experiences the soldiers and the civilians have having, the level of casualties on their own territory, something we've never experienced and, God willing, never will. And they don't expect us to understand that. They don't expect that much of us. They've had almost 3 years now to take their notion of what we're like all they really want from us is a meaningless fraction of weapons which we wouldn't have used anyway in almost every case. That's all they want, that's all they want. And we create these incredible discursive acrobatics around these weapons, which most likely in most cases we're just going to be dated out and not used anyway. It's kind of an extraordinary thing. And I want to echo what you said. I was in Kharkiv region, about 2 weeks ago now, talking to soldiers not too terribly far away from the line. And, that this is essentially what they said. They said, they're very realistic about us. And they'd said, go back and tell the Americans, we don't want your troops. And I know that, but they want to be, they don't need our troops. They're trying to do this on their own. They just need a little tiny bit of help to get them over the top. So I agree very strongly with your sentiment. And there's this just kind of funny misunderstanding. We talk about how we're tired. What are we tired of? There's nobody. The only people in America who could be tired by this war would be the guys and the women who work in our munitions factories who now have jobs, who didn't have jobs before. But aside from them, who can possibly be tired? The Ukrainians are doing this for us. They're giving us this opportunity to hold things back and to keep things in place. And it's an opportunity that we really have to take. And as far as what you said, your main point, the judgment about the costs of the war. The Ukrainians know something that we don't, which is what Russian occupation is like. They know that Russian occupation involves torture on a very large scale. They know that it involves the murder of local elites. They know that there are lists of all of the men and women, the Ukrainian armed forces and their families, and those people will be tracked down and tortured and very likely shot and left in a pit. They know that their children will be deported to Siberia and assimilated into Russian culture. They know what those are not just my descriptions. Those are the things that Russia, in fact, has done on the territories it occupies. So they know what they're holding back, and they know that they can't stop the killing by giving up. And they also know that it's not just about dying. It's about what kind of life that you want to live, and what are the things you're willing to take risks for. I agree with you. We can't make those judgments for them. What we can do is make it possible for them to defend themselves.
Yeah, I mentioned this in our last show, but I spoke with the head of an orphanage in the Kherson region who had 60 of his kids abducted by Russia, and his only information about them now are propaganda videos that the Russians are trickling out featuring these kids. It's barbaric. I want to talk about the book because everyone should read it, and your discussion of the Russian approach to this war as the exercise of one man's fantasy has frightening echoes in America today. You know whose fantasy I'm talking about. And I want to read for you this section from a subchapter called America's End, very well titled. Americans live in a country where a sitting president gave advance warning that he would declare victory even if he lost an election. Having lost decisively in November of 2020, Donald Trump proceeded to declare victory with Hitlerian boldness, speaking of a historical landslide. He repeated claims of fraud that he knew to be false and urged his followers to support him in overthrowing representative government. I don't know where the question is, but I'm sure you have thoughts on how we tackle this in the next 30 plus days.
Well, one thing which I find very encouraging is that the campaign is not just, you can't just campaign against Trump. You have to understand that he represents not just a challenge to the system. He represents the end of the system. And if you want to preserve the system, you have to enliven it. You have to enlighten it. You have to make it better. I've kind of come to think that, of course, sometimes there are moments where you have to mount a defense, but Trump is a long-term phenomenon, and the way to win this election and the way to do the right things afterward, I think, are to talk about the positive values like freedom, and and to use freedom to remind people that life can be much better than it is, and that we don't have to be angry at others all the time, that the government can actually do good things for us if it's animated by the right ideals and run by the right people. And that, freedom is not about driving yourself into your own pigeonhole. It's not about being angry and alienated. Freedom is about doing stuff together so that as a country, we can all get better. And I think that's the way to win. It's not only the right thing to do, but I think it's also the way to win. Like, it will get very dark if Trump wins. But I think that every single person who is going to understand that by early November has already understood that. I'm happy to talk about it. I've been talking about it for a decade, but I think the way to win is to go positive and to say that, like, Trump's dark fantasy is something that doesn't have to be. There are many things which are much better, and those things could come to be.
I'd love for you to build on this idea of positive freedom, which is the theme of the book. And it's a great follow-up to a conversation we just had with Billy Ray. Billy Ray is the screenwriter for The Hunger Games, Captain Phillips, and an incredible political messenger as well. I didn't think our conversation would be about freedom, but he made the point that of all the the meta issues in American politics, freedom always ranks at the top of the list. And the moment a conversation becomes about freedom, it shifts. When the gun debate became about freedom, the left began to lose. When the mask debate became about freedom, it was a much tougher argument to make. Your characterization of positive freedom, it creates a way to talk about freedom that I think is new, and it's right, and it gives the left, of which I consider myself a part, but I would argue the American politic writ large, a way to discuss freedom in a way that it's additive. It doesn't take away other people's freedom.
Yeah. Okay. So on the philosophy for 1 minute, and then the politics. So, this is a conservative book in the sense that I think that there is a right and a wrong answer. That is, there's a right and a wrong way to talk about freedom. I think the right way to talk about freedom, as you say, is positive philosophically, because there are good things in the world. There's loyalty, there's honesty, there's grace, there's beauty. There are many good things. And freedom is the state in which we can balance those things, because they don't always all go together. It's hard. You can't always be loyal and honest at the same time. You can't always be merciful. You can't be merciful and consistent at the same time, although consistency and mercy are both good things. But a free person is able to see the good things in the world, see the virtues that there are in the world, and balance them, make decisions. But then freedom is positive politically, because how do we create such people? Like, how do we create a Ken Harbaugh or a Tim Snyder? How do we create people in the inner city or in the countryside, on the coast, in the middle of the country, who can grow up to become free? And the answer is, you can't just leave them alone. What the American common sense is negative freedom, which just says, like, the problem is the barrier, the problem is the prison wall, the problem is the government. But the limit of that is that if you just get rid of all of that stuff, you still have the question of, what kind of a person should I be? And then when you're talking about newborn babies, it's, what kind of conditions do you have to have in place so that child could become free? So that child can become the kind of person that could weigh values and make choices. And so, starting from freedom, you work your way towards a different argument for things like kindergarten or parental leave or vacations or healthcare or whatever you might have. I think the real justification for all of those things is freedom, because you can't have a land of the free without those things. And so, a justification for me, the only justification for a government is freedom. So it's elegant and easy, but fundamentally wrong to say, I want to be free, therefore I want to destroy the government. If you destroy the government, then there are going to be other powers that rush in to fill the gap. The oligarchs will rush in to fill the gap. You're not going to be free. It's not going to work out that way. But if what you say is government should only do the things which help people to grow up to become free in our society, then you define purposes for government. It won't be too big. It won't be too small. It'll be doing the things which are right. And so all these things which on the left have been argued for in terms of social justice, I don't think that's a mistake. I think social justice is a very important value, but I think the fundamental argument for all these things is actually freedom. It's an argument from freedom.
It's Ken Harbaugh. Quick break here because I have two favors to ask. We're off to a great start with the Ken Harbaugh Show on YouTube, but the podcast needs a little love. Please click the link below to follow, rate, and review. The success of shows like this really does depend on those ratings. And if you haven't yet followed me on Patreon, please check it out. It's free to sign up, or you can pitch in a few bucks a month. Every dollar goes back into this show and our pro-democracy efforts, including the reporting from Ukraine. Go to patreon.com/Ken Harbaugh. Thanks for the support. You talk about oligarchs rushing in to fill the gap. And I think the clearest example of that is the First Amendment and freedom of speech. And you said this in a recent interview. Free speech today is defending the algorithmic utterances of billionaires. Great phrase. We've detached it from the person and divorced it from the idea of speaking truth to power. We've seen that play out again and again. I think the most damaging example of late, and I'm sure you share this special concern with me as a fellow Ohioan, is what happened to Springfield, Ohio, when Elon Musk and others piled on, amplified this lie, and the algorithm made it a meme. And real people suffered supposedly out of deference to the First Amendment.
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful question. I mean, it goes to something which is very fundamental, which is freedom is about the person. Like freedom is about those people in Springfield, the actual people. Freedom is about people. It's about the things we do. So with free speech, I actually kind of think free speech is a misnomer. I think freedom of speech is better, but I think the most useful phrase is one that we don't use, which is free speakers. How do we make Americans free speakers? How do we make sure that the least privileged American is able to speak freely? How do we get to that point? How do we make people feel safe? And how do we provide the structures of protection, but also how do we provide the structures of information so that people have things to say, so that we can communicate with one another? For me, that's what freedom of speech is all about. It's about starting from the person. The risk when we talk about free speech, where that misnomer takes us, is that we start worrying about the utterance. So if Elon Musk can magnify something 1 trillion times, somehow that's 1 trillion moments where I have to care about free speech. But it isn't really, because his freedom of speech is not threatened in the least. I mean, the man owns a social media platform. And so you can't really start thinking about this without starting from the person rather than the utterances. And by remembering, as you've already invoked, why we have freedom of speech. It's not a random thing. We don't have freedom of speech so that you can say obnoxious stuff. You can, but it's not there so that you can be obnoxious. The reason why one has freedom of speech is because telling the truth to power is risky. That's why you have it, because you want to have a political system where power can be checked by truth. And so in order to have power to be checked by truth, you have to have freedom of speech. And that is worth remembering, because although, of course, freedom of speech is going to protect powerful people, the essence of it is to make sure that everybody can speak truth to power. And what also, so when we're thinking about freedom of speech, if we're in a world or in a country where we're most worried about the billionaires, or even worse, if we're most worried about their social platforms, then we are a whole universe away, a whole perverted universe away from what freedom of speech should actually be concerned about, which is the corporeal risk that an individual human being takes when finding out the truth and trying to speak that truth to people who are wealthy or who are more powerful.
Well, that risk will be manifest should Trump be elected. The number of people that I've spoken to, some of whom have reached out and said, I'm making backup plans. I'm getting a second passport, right? I'm talking about flag officers, for example. It's truly terrifying. I agree with everything you have said, which as an interviewer always makes me a little nervous and self-critical this far into a conversation. So I'm going to try to find a point of disagreement. You have said that there is no natural human propensity for truth. Can you explain that? Because my instinct is to believe that over time, truth does emerge. Progress couldn't happen. Science couldn't happen if truth wasn't privileged in some way. How do you explain this idea that we don't have a natural propensity for truth?
All right. I'm gonna start in a different place. I think there is truth in the world.
Good.
Right. So when I look over the screen, I'm looking at a tree, and that tree is there because of photosynthesis. I think photosynthesis is true. I think we can understand it. I think there are a lot of processes, not only natural, but social, that we can understand. I believe that there's truth in the world. That I believe. And I believe that we can get closer to that truth. We can chase that horizon on faster and faster horses, let's say. We can have better and better ways. You mentioned science. We can have better and better procedures, which can get us close to that truth, to the point where we can use it, right? And freedom, this has directly to do with freedom, because freedom isn't about banging your head against the wall necessarily. Sometimes you do have to do that. Sometimes you have to knock down that wall, and sometimes all you have is your head. But sometimes what freedom is about is taking those barriers and putting them to use, which you can only do if you understand them, right? Like, so if you launch a projectile or throw a ball or even just take a walk, you're working together with gravity. Like, you understand gravity, which is why you can do things. So much of what we can do so much of the ways that we make ourselves free has to do with building tools. And we build tools on the basis of truths that we understand about the world. Now, that said, I'm giving credit to the world here. And I think we have to earn it, right? We have to earn it. So I come from a world of, East European studies. My thinkers for me who were important are people like Victor Klemperer, who kept a diary during the Hitler period in Nazi Germany, or Václav Havel, who appears in the book, who wrote so importantly about what he called normalization in Czechoslovakia, communist Czechoslovakia in the 1970s. And what they observed, and I think they're right, is that we are capable of living in untruth. We're capable of fastening ourselves onto myths which provide, narrative explanations of everything, but which aren't true. And I think we have to have this sad reckoning with human experience and see, okay, as Havel put it, we're capable of living in truth, but we're also capable of living in untruth, right? We see that all around us. We know that it's possible. So I would say we have the capacity for it, but it does depend on a value choice. And that value choice is pretty evident in the world around us. When a J.D. Vance says, essentially, I know it's not true about the cats and dogs. I know I'm making it up. I know I'm not going to use this phrase. I know that I'm giving you a story. He's choosing the big lie. He's choosing a world of fantasy, right? That's a value choice. He's choosing mendacity. He's choosing that black hole. Whereas other people can say, I choose to care about the actual lives of people in Springfield, Ohio, right? I choose to care about the kids, who are now in their 50s, who I used to play basketball against in Springfield, Ohio. I care about their actual apprehensions, what actually happens around them. That's a different set of value, but we can't do it without the value commitment. You can't, I think a lot of folks would like to be able to say, well, what Trump and Vance is doing is bad, but what is the truth anyway? And I'm afraid that what is the truth anyway is not an available position. If you start with what is truth anyway, the guys with the spectacle, with the guys with the money, the guys who are ruthless are going to win the story war. You have to start with, I believe there's some truth. It's tricky. It's complicated. It's human. We need different methods and so on, but I want to get there. If you start from that attitude, then you can start to resist. But once you concede the field, so this is where it comes back to whether it's natural or not. Because if it were natural, it would just come to us. And I don't think it does. I think we have to say, okay, I know the truth is sometimes going to hurt. I know it's sometimes going to take some work, but for reasons having to do with my own dignity and for reasons having to do with the kind of society I want to live in, I'm going to push for it. I'm going to try to find it.
Fair enough. I'm going to mull over that a lot. Last question, a bit philosophical. You are an historian living in historic times. Do you ever step back and think about the rarity of that? The historians you channel are ones who themselves were documenting historic times while living through them. Václav Havel, Klemperer. That is an extraordinary opportunity. The analog in the military, I'm a Navy pilot, is the soldier who participates in an epic changing conflict. That's extremely rare. Do you ever think about the significance of being the kind of historian whose analysis is happening in the moment and will shape the way people think about this time for decades or centuries to come?
I'm going to say something super boring because the question was such a beautiful grand setup. I think because I'm a historian, I have a certain luxury, which is that I can take time to figure things out. So we talked about 1938. I feel like I've got a pretty good grip on 1938 because I wrote a book in which there was a chapter about it. And to write that chapter, I sat for weeks with the Czechoslovak, the British, the French, the Soviet, the German, the Polish, the American diplomatic documents, as well as newspaper sources and a bunch of other sources. And I was able to put things together day by day, hour by hour, in a way that the people at the time could not have done. In fact, like living through it isn't the same thing as understanding it. Historical understanding involves sometimes a lot more than being there at the time. And so I try to be humble about being there at the time. I try to remember that being there at the time means that, you may believe you have some kind of privilege, but you're also missing lots of stuff. And so what I try to do is I try to say, okay, if I've understood some things about 1938, maybe those things will open up a view into 2024 that we wouldn't have had otherwise. And that's about as far as I go. So I'm not going to take the step up to that pedestal of like thinking that I'm like a chronicler of important times and so on. What I try to do is I try to bring to bear the skills that I think I have in a way which hopefully will be useful. And that's about as far as I would go.
Well, I just compared you to Václav Havel, and I stand by it. I'm a huge fan, Tim. Let's do this again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ken. I'm really glad we could do it.
Love this video? Make sure you stay up to date on the latest breaking news and all things Meidas by signing up to the MeidasTouch newsletter at MeidasTouch.com/newsletter.